sung at Latin masses throughout the world, and thanks be to God, including great parishes like right here at Holy Innocents. These chants would have been unrecognizable to most any Catholic of 150 years ago. Now, we know that the chants are quite ancient. In fact, the very system or the very fact of musical notation was developed precisely in order to record chants that already predated that system by hundreds and hundreds of years. So we know that the chant is ancient, and yet we also know that what was being sung in Catholic churches, let's say in the 1840s, 1850s, even then in the 1900s in most places, bore very little relationship to what had been sung, let's say, in the 12th century or in the 10th century. And the reason that we have this, the reason we can make this comparison is because of the work of the monks at Salem. The printed melodies of the chant are the creative fruit of decades of study by those monks at Salem, which is the first. It's a very important, as I'm sure you all know, is an extremely important monastery. In many ways, perhaps the most important in the entire Benedictine world. It's the first monastic refoundation after the horrors of the Revolution, and these monks, in responding to the crisis of the church, I mean, and you can't get much worse than 1789 and 1790, and the last decade of the 18th century. There, they knew the status quo ante was not sufficient. They couldn't just go back to 1788 and say, "Oh, okay, well that's fine. We'll stop just before things get really before things got truly bad and leave it there." They knew that was not enough if this was to be an authentic cultivation, a planting of seed, a tilling of the soil, and planting of seed. For them, that going beyond the status quo ante was a restoration that entailed discovering roots that ran deeper than the horrors of Robespierre, and deeper than the indifference of the Enlightenment, and deeper even than the Council of Trent. So what I hope to illustrate in the historical first third of the talk, and also in the musical second third, is that the transmission history of this most ancient of musics is a good model for us, not just practically in terms of what we sing at Mass, but also by analogy to the general project of Catholic traditional restoration. So, the Abbey of Salem, which is sort of in the southwestern quadrant of that great country, it's on this. It's an absolutely beautiful place. Have any of you ever had occasion to visit? Really? Not one person here? Yes, that's right. It's the Abbey of Salem. That's Solesmes. If you ever find yourself then, if they ever allow us to travel again, be sure to make a pilgrimage there. It's a bit out of the way, but it's well worth it. It's on this beautiful river called the Sarthe, and it runs right underneath this massive stone monastery. So the Monastic Foundation is from about 1010, from the year 1010, and it had waxing and waning fortunes, for the first few centuries of its existence. I mean, it was burned to the ground in the 100 Years' War, but then it was rebuilt towards the end of the 1400s, and in the 17th century and into the 18th century, it was in decline. And this, I think, is really important for us, right? It was not a golden age of of monasticism in France, or at least not everywhere in France, certainly not at Salem, in 1785 and 1787 to 1788. That is suddenly cut off. It was declining anyway, and that rot from within, that moral rot, that corporate rot, is part of the reason that it fell so easily. So when the National Constituent Assembly met and prohibited all religious vows in February of 1790, in the first year of the revolution, the monks began to leave, and most of them were arrested and deported to Jersey, the Isle of Jersey. There was one monk who stayed and would hide out and say masses in the area, for the Catholics who remained. But it went from bad to worse. They expelled the monks. They burned down the archives of this important monastery in 1794, and there just kind of sits for a generation and a half, just sort of a hulk, this beautiful stone hulk on this beautiful river, and along comes in the early 1830s a young priest who is from the town. The town that's nearest the monastery is called Sablé-sur-Sarthe. It's maybe, it's a 10-minute drive on this little on this tiny little country lane. So he's from this town, and is ordained for that diocese. I think it was the diocese of Le Mans, and he has a vision, this young priest, by the name of Dom Prosper Gueranger, or I should say that he became Dom, but Père Prosper Gueranger, who saw this magnificent vista and this magnificent, building, and had a vision, had a dream of reestablishing a Benedictine foundation there. And so he arranges for it to be purchased. And the building was this close to just being torn down because it was in such bad shape and it had been neglected for so long. But he arranged a few savvy laymen to get together and purchase this property. And in 1833, in come the Benedictines. And if you're starting a monastery, you just start doing it. You gather the people in and profess vows and start praying the office, and off you go, right? So 4 years later, in 1837, he receives papal approval for this, and of course, it's understood at the time that this is an extremely important project because of what the last 50 years of violence and bloodshed in France. This is a really, really important thing that's happening there. And it's interesting that approval was delayed for several years because Dom Gueranger, in the enthusiasm of youth, had been dabbling in Gallicanism, or not dabbling. That's unfair. But he had written a warm letter of support, and I think had exchanged a few letters with one of the bishops in that region who was a known Gallicanist. So the whole project at Salem from the outset was viewed by the Pope, was viewed in Rome with a bit of suspicion. These French who have gone down this Gallicanist road before, are they up to it again? And so very early on, Gueranger makes the decision that the right of the monastery, and that's how it is in almost every Benedictine house, that the mass that is said is the Roman rite, and then there's the Benedictine office, which has a different arrangement of the Psalms. And that's still true to this day. Then, so in they come in the 1830s. Towards the end of the 1830s, they get the papal approval, and it's going from strength to strength. They're starting to attract vocations. This is a very important thing. This is understood, by Catholics of goodwill, especially by men who want to be monks of goodwill, that this is a project to get on board with. So, here they have to restore this building, right? And they have to bring back for the first time a monastic practice, a monastic liturgical practice, both in the Mass and in the Divine Office, in a way that had not been done in France for those many years. But as I was saying at the outset, Dom Gueranger, who's a man of great spiritual insight, he understood that it was not enough to just take the chants that had been sung around the world, that were being sung around the world, and do that. He knew this was insufficient. Why was it insufficient? All right. Well, as I said, part of the reason, or part of the going deeper, part of the going deeper by going further backward of the Salem project, this magnificent 19th century project of the saintly Gueranger, is understanding where compromises were made along the way by the Church, possibly for quite understandable and laudatory reasons at the time, but saying, there's a wrong turn at this point, and we need to go back prior to that wrong turn. Sound familiar? But the wrong turn that I'm talking about here is not, also has to do with a council, actually. But it's the Council of Trent that I'm speaking about. So, of course, we all know the story of the Council of Trent, the on-again, off-again council that finally, after several decades and after a great deal of political interference of one sort or another, finally gets around to not simply condemning the heresy of Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and that whole crowd, but also to manifest an authentic counterattack, a counter-revolution, a counter-reformation. And part of that, as project as we know, is the standardization of the Latin Rite liturgy, of the Western liturgical practice throughout Christendom, or I should say that throughout Western Christendom, because in most places there were variants in the liturgical practice, there were variants in the chants. If you were in the diocese of Tournai, let's say, a very important diocese in the Middle Ages, in the very northeast part of what is now France, almost into Belgium. If you were there on Sundays, you sang a sequence that was proper to the diocese of Tournai, just because you were in Tournai. I mean, and this was by far not the, or it was by no means the only example of that sort of thing. So St. Pius V understands that there's a need for uniformity, and he says, look, we're going to take the Roman Rite as it's practiced in the court of Rome, and essentially do away with regional variants that are, that don't have the force of antiquity, that are under 200 years old. And obviously there are a few of these, a few quite significant practices that were a lot older than that continue. But part of that project is saying, all right, we've got a standardized, starting with the Missal of 1570, this codification that Pius V effects in 1570. There's a need for a standardization of the chant, so that the chant can be sung in various contexts. So it can be sung in monasteries, can be sung in magnificent cathedrals, but also in small parish churches that don't have the same kind of musical resources. And so a commission is put together in the late 1580s, and it goes into the 1590s, and it includes such luminaries as Palestrina. And the project is to simplify the chant. It is literally, well, not, well, if they had these kinds of shears and Elmer's glue, it would have been the literal cut and paste thing of taking the chant and taking out these long melismas that are in the chant in order to make it more approachable and to make it easier to sing. What do I mean by melisma? A melisma is a series of a great many notes on a single syllable. Just to take an example, there's the gradual Justus ut Palma, which is sung for a number of saints' days. Justus ut palma florebit, the just man shall flourish like the palm tree. And the gradual goes like this. Justus ut palma florebit. Now on florebit, there's this wonderful, maybe 10-note, 12-note elaboration, right? Justus ut palma florebit, sicut cedrus, right? Or take an alleluia, and an alleluia is perhaps the best example where that melisma, that is to say, all the many notes for one syllable, there are so many of them that in an alleluia it has its own proper name. It's called a jubilus, because it's a rejoicing. It's a wordless rejoicing. Alleluia. It's not even going high. It's just a great many notes, and there's a joy in that, right? So, for pastorally understandable reasons, in the context of the Catholic and Protestant clash of the 16th century, the Pope judges it advisable to have this commission to trim the chants, to make them easier to sing. Now, Palestrina dies in 1594, so this is right at the end of his career. And his lending his name to this project became a bit of a problem for the next 300 or 400 years or so, because any time that there's an objection raised to this trimming, they'd say, "Oh, but Palestrina did this," right? Well, as it turns out, Palestrina didn't actually have a whole lot to do with it. They used his name a lot more than they used his work, It seems that he was only working on propers in the cycle after Pentecost. So there's a whole swath of the church here that he didn't even touch. But that addition, by the early 1600s, becomes, if you will, imposed on the church as the standard for Western plain chant, and that's the standard. It's printed in a somewhat clunky way. I don't have an example of it on the handout. Oh, and do you all have the handout? Okay, good. So on the handout, I don't have an example of it. It's almost so clunky, I almost didn't want to include it. It meant that the church, in its musical practice, was sort of hemmed in by this immediate post-Tridentine pastoral decision. And Dom Gueranger understood there was a problem, because Dom Gueranger, along with a number of other young men who had joined the monastery, professed as monks, become ordained, who were starting this project under Gueranger's sort of overall supervision, they understood through firsthand experience just how much more rich the chant was. I speak in particular of two monks, Dom Paul Jossian, who died quite young, actually, at the age of 35. He was ordained in 1858. And the very wonderful Dom Joseph Potier, who was ordained around about the same time and died in the early 20s. So these two monks in particular fanned out across Europe and started to look at what the chant what the actual manuscripts were. So now on the handout I have for you, these are all examples of the Alma Redemptoris, right? How many of you have sung the Alma Redemptoris Mater? Oh, okay, good, fantastic. I'm about to call on you to do that, actually. But take a look at the examples here. So at the top of the page, we have the text itself, right, of the Alma Redemptoris. And I'll explain in a moment why I have the accented syllables bold. Then there are two chants here. You see this one here on the left? That's the simple tone of the Alma Redemptoris, sung as the Marian antiphon at the end of Compline. The one on the right is the solemn tone, sung on Sundays, let's say. Now, for almost any of us who have looked at chant, that's what we're used to seeing, right? We're used to seeing the staff with the 4 lines and square notes that are very, very clear, and this kind of printing. This style of the printing of the chant is a product of the monks of Salem. This did not exist in anything even remotely as elegant as this, up until the publication, really in 1907, of the Vatican Gradual, which we will touch on. But before we get to that, take a look at these 3 manuscripts that have the exact same chant. And I've chosen these in part because they're among the oldest ones. This one here on the bottom from Engelberg, Engelberg 103, that's, I think that's early 13th century? I think that's right. And it's a little bit hard to read, which of course is part of my point. In fact, it's a large part of my point. Do you see in the upper right corner, on the first full line of chant, that there's All Mother? Oh, yeah. See it there? And if you start there, Alma, and then go on to the 3rd line, Redemptoris Mater qui pervia celi porta manis, right? There it is. There's a big difference between this and and here. And what's that? It's got no staff. There's no way you can know what that sounds like unless you've already heard it being sung. And this is a really important point when thinking about chant notation. It's there to notate something that already pre-existed it by literally hundreds of years. And it's acting as an aide-memoire to what is already known by the monks. It's not so much to say, in the way that we think of a musical score as basically being a blueprint, right? Akin to a blueprint for a house, right? If you want to build a house, you get the blueprint, you followed it to a T, and you use this kind of 2x4 here and this kind of thing here, right? This is manifestly not the case here. It only makes sense if you've already heard it before. Now, turn over to the next one. Yeah, these ones are even earlier. The one on the top from St. Gallen, 388, that's from the 12th century. So we've been able to date that. The one on top is 12th century, maybe with some additions as late as the 14th century, but it's certainly no later than that. And you can see that there's, that on the top here, right? Is Alma Redemptoris, right? Have a look at the one on the bottom, which is St. Gallen 390. That's the late 10th century. Now stop and think about the fact that what we're looking at here is over 1,000 years old. Well, not this actual Xerox, but the thing that is Xerox is over 1,000 years old. And you can see if you just compare this 390 with 388, you can see how much similarity there is in the general shape. So I mean, just have a glance at Alma, at the first 2 words, Alma Redemptoris. That's here and here, right? You see there's a long series of notes on one syllable, which is called what? A melisma. Very good, very good. So there's a long melisma on Alma, and then shorter on Redemptoris. And you see there's a difference in penmanship, but it's still essentially the same melody. Now, I should mention that these manuscripts from St. Gallen, from the great Swiss monastery of St. Gallen, are really, really important for the study of chant, in part because they're so clear. I mean, 390, I mean, you could, you basically sing the office from that. If you know how it goes, every single note is crystal clear with that penmanship. But also it's so complete, and that's true both in the St. Gallen antiphoners, which which contain the antiphons and the other chants of the divine office, but also in the graduals, or I should say the graduales, which contain most of the chants of the Mass. Now, I'd just like to point out something too, if you could turn back to the first page on that. There's a wonderful poetry to the text of the Alma Redemptoris, and it's probably from about the 10th century or so, and that is that it's written in dactylic. It's a poem. It's a Latin poem in dactylic hexameter. Right? You think of the Aeneid, right? Arma verumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris, right? Here we've got something very similar. If we scan it, and I should say, but by the way, I don't have it scanned here. I'll kind of do it at sight with the Latin teachers in the room. Please forgive my scansion if it's a little bit off, or please correct. But Alma Redemptoris materque per via celi, porta manes et stella maris succurre cadenti, surgere qui corat populo tuque genuisti, right? Natura mirante tuum sanctum genitorem, Virgo prius ac posterius Gabrielis abore, sumens illud ave peccatorum miserere. That's something like that. Which is quite wonderful. To know that when we're singing this at the end of Mass, it's not simply a beautiful prayer to Our Lady, though it is that first and foremost. It's also a wonderful example of the medieval mind at work taking classical forms and applying it here. Also, if we may say so, giving a bit of a lie to any Enlightenment, how should we say, argument or presupposition of a dark ages where there was no understanding of Latin poetry of the classical age until along come the humanists. I mean, obviously, I think all of us in this room know that this is a fallacy, and one that has been politicized against the church for quite a few centuries. But this is just a great example, all right? A very small example of the classical roots of what we pray in the office. Now, we're going to do a little singing. I hope you've eaten your pizza and digested it well, such that you have strong voices. On the top here, all of those bolds are corresponding to the Latin tonic accent. So this is distinct from the Rhodian classical meter that I was just using. And this is simply calling out, if you'll excuse my saying it, a stress in the words. Alma redemptoris mater que per via celi. That's how we would tend to say it now, right? Porta manes et stella maris succurre cadenti. Now, do you hear what's happening on my voice here? The quality of the accent is not an accent like this. It's not sort of a loudspeaker accent of the air being pushed this way. It's more of sort of an up up-pulling, right? Porta manes et stella maris succure cadenti, sorgere qui curat populo, tuque genuisti natura mirante, and so forth. I'd like to ask you, if I may, that we all sing this just on a single pitch. Just on a single pitch. Don't sing any of the melodies. I mean, you know, if you want to sing the one from St. Gallen 390, please be my guest in a few minutes. But for right now, just on a single pitch. Alma Redemptoris Mater. Ready? Here we go. Alma Redemptoris Mater, que per via celi, porta manes et stella maris succure cadenti, sorgere qui corat populo, tuque genuisti, and so forth, all right? Now, do the same thing, but this time on all of the accents, or on all of the bolded accents. Can we raise the please, can we raise the pitch by one? Like this. Alma Redemptoris Mater, que per via celi. Let's try that, ready? Alma Redemptoris Mater, que per via celi, porta manes et stella maris succure cadenti, sorgere qui corat populo, tuque genuisti, natura mirante tuum sanctum genitorem, Virgo prius ac posterius Gabrielis ab ore, sumens illud ave peccatorum miserere. That's beautiful. And you see how different that is from how we would speak it, right? If we were to speak it, Alma Redemptoris Mater, que per via, you know, sort of this kind of thing. I'm sure not anyone here, but if you go out onto the corner of Broadway and ask a passerby, excuse me, sir, I wonder if you could please recite this, and he says, why, that's dactylic hexameter, isn't it? In most cases, you would tend to get this. Now, this is so important for a point I want to make about Gueranger and Dom Potier and Dom Maquereau, who's in the next generation of monks. And that is a statement of Gueranger that it is more important to have a beautifully sung chant than it is to have an academically pristine edition. Now, if we can have an academically pristine, scare quotes, edition, so much the better. But it's very interesting what they did at Salem in the midst of all this paleographic research. So these examples that I'm showing you here, these two from St. Gallen, there's one on the bottom of the first page from Engelberg. What would happen is these few monks, especially Dom Potier, would fan out to these libraries and copy them down by hand. Now, a little bit later on, once it became possible to have photography, that was employed as well. And in fact, the monks at Salem were among the very first in any academic field of anything to employ photography as part of their work. But prior to that, they had to learn to copy. And it's really interesting to read correspondence between Dom Gueranger, the abbot of Salem, the founding abbot of Salem, and Dom Potier, and between him and other monks, and they're discussing how a young monk is coming along and his copying skills, and this is all to the good. So they'd go out and copy these things and bring them back to Salem. Now, bear in mind, there's no TGV or EasyJet or anything like this to go and pop up and spend a few days in the cathedral at Laon, which, by the way, is a very important town for chant in the north of France. Absolutely exquisite cathedral town on this great cliff that overlooks, the valley for 20 miles or something. So it's a very important center for points of comparison with, say, the St. Gallen manuscripts. So Dampartier would go up for 8 days or 10 days and then have to come back to attend to his duties at the monastery. He couldn't just take off for 3 years and go and copy out manuscripts to his heart's content, right? So they bring them back and start comparing them. And that work, which is really starting in the, I'd say the 1850s, it's really underway in earnest. By the early 1860s, there are the first editions that they're starting to put out. And and the small detail I found quite charming. What they started with, the very first publication of the great Abbey of Salem, the center for Gregorian chant, in the whole world. Their first publication to show what's possible is a tiny little book, like that big, of the chants at the blessing of meals. That's what they started with, which is a good thing for us to bear in mind. Start with something. Is the blessing with meals? Great. If you want to sing the blessing at meals, that's a great place to start. Wonderful, great. And then the next book, it took a long time. It was 1864, and it was published, and then it sat for some reason in the publishing house, and there was a huge fire, and it destroyed all the copies. I think there are 4 in the world that are extant. This was supposed to have been the first chant edition of some note. Pardon the pun. But it's only really, and we'll skip over the really fascinating history in the later, in the latter half, let's say, of the 19th century, about the battles for the soul of the chant. And I don't think it's too strong to describe it that way. I'll just briefly say that two really important events come into play, and they're both round about the year 1870. The first is the First Vatican Council, and the second is the Franco-Prussian War, because the battle for the soul of the chant, the battle between the production of a beautiful edition like this one, this nice clean copy we have here, from these manuscript sources, and the going along with the status quo ante became a proxy for the French-Prussian, or the French and United German, what became United Germany, this fight, which obviously becomes the defining characteristic of European politics for the next 70 or 80 years. That battle was being fought both inside the church and outside the church as a proxy war. It was a proxy war for the Franco-Prussian War, which ended pretty swiftly with the defeat of Napoleon III and the end of the Second Empire, the beginning of the profoundly, what became the profoundly anti-Catholic Third Republic. It became this proxy war back and forth, and Leo XIII gets drawn into this conflict and is asked to decide, so Holiness, which one's it going to be? And he again, this is a great oversimplification, as I say. It's really fascinating history. And if you're interested in a book, I can please come and speak to me afterwards. I have a really great one on this very subject to recommend. I'll tell you, it's by Dom Pierre Coum. It's called The Restoration of Gregorian Chant, Salem and the Vatican Edition. And it took a long time for it to come out in English translation, which it finally did in 2003. It's a really fascinating history. But with Pius X, with the election of Giuseppe Sarto as Pius X in 1903, here finally is the opening for the monks at Salem to let their chant burst forth upon the world. And what they had begun printing, and this is point number 2 perhaps for the modern day application, what they began printing, they said very clearly, in the 1860s, 1870s, this is for the use of the monastery at Salem. We're not trying to make any claims about what your parish should be doing or your diocese should be doing. There was and there have been some proposals for collaboration, say the Diocese of Reims, for instance, to have some sort of cross-pollination. And Dom Gueranger wisely understood that it was more prudent to back away from that and just do their own thing. And that prudence, that local, the local initiative, if you will, gets rewarded ultimately by becoming the standard for chant in the church. And so Pius X, he calls Dom Gueranger in and says, what are we going to do about the chant in the church? And he said, well, it's funny you should ask. As you know, we've been working on these for a long time. And he says, and how long is it going to take? How long is it going to take to make an edition, that is complete? And he says, about 50 years. And the Pope said, well, you got about 3, so get to work. Now it's really interesting to note that that any preconception we have that these monks have a nice, peaceful, bucolic existence, free from the cares of the world, and they get up and they pray their matins and lauds, and they go and do something, and they have prime and mass and sort of thing. Well, yes, it's true they're doing that, but it's not a romantic kind of existence. They're very much subject to the vicissitudes, to the political vicissitudes of the day. In fact, they were thrown out of their newly refounded monastery. And bear in mind, this is post the revolution, post the refounding. They were thrown out at 4 different times: 1880, 81, 82, I think, and then especially, the big one was in 1901 with the passage of the new French secularization laws. There are these tragic, heartbreaking photographs of the townsfolk from this tiny village there with rifles pointed at the monks to drive them out. And so the monks have to leave France, and they go to and they found Coire Abbey on the Isle of Wight. It's a beautiful place. And they're there from 1902 to the early 1920s. So it's really interesting that a lot of the real foment, as far as their chant work, was actually done in England and not in France. So that's the overview, right? That's what I wanted to present to you tonight. The story of Salem, grounded in the vision of one heroic, saintly priest. And perhaps we should start with saintly and then say heroic and courageous, and shrewd and wise and so forth. Dom Gueranger, Prosper Gueranger, and how he trained his successors prudently, didn't try to move too quickly, and knew that he had to respond to what's happening politically. Had to be on his feet. Had to be able to change to change in order to avoid being shut down. Being shut down by the forces of the aggressively secular French state, and also by the Vatican, or perhaps we shouldn't say the Vatican, at that time, but by the Pope, and the Church generally. They start small, they start locally, but they never give up. They never give up on this project, which seems so impossible to construct a useful edition for the entire church based on manuscripts that are over 1,000 years old, and yet what we sing and what we take for granted, what we take for granted at every Latin Mass that is sung the world over, is the fruit of their work. So there we have it. History, a little bit of music theory to talk about the beautiful singing of the chant, and application. If you have questions, I should be happy to entertain them, especially on the application part. If you have any questions about what's going on now, or please anything at all. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. What notation was used for the revision of chants after Trent? Was it a primitive version of what Solesmes Salem ended up doing, or something completely different?
Yes and no.
Yes.
Oh, sure.
We have a microphone.
Oh, look at that.
What was the notation used in the edition of Chant prepared after Trent?
So in the Ratisbon, well, so it's called the Medicean edition. It was first published, in the 16 teens, and then gets republished as the Regensburg or the Ratisbon edition. Part of what was interesting about it, and somewhat revolutionary at the time, was that it was done at least in some of the later iterations by means of a typeface. So it could be mass produced. This was very useful in the age of Protestant tracts being churned out on these newfangled printing presses, these relatively newfangled printing presses. So you could churn out chants with the right kind of font. You've got a font for the four-line staff, and then a four-line staff with a note here, four-line staff with a note here. Each one is its own little thing in the tray. But you can see it. You can see how uneven it is. And in order to be, and there's a trade-off, especially at that time, early 17th century, and then as I say, then on, especially into the 18th century, it looks clunky on the page because it is clunky. It's a thing being done by this, by basically an industrial process. The notes are very, if I may say so, if I may be so bold as to editorialize even slightly, they're crude. I mean, they're very, very big, so it's quite easy to see, but there's not much in the way of rhythmic subtlety. There are almost no rhythmic indications at all. There are a few exceptions to that, but it's not nearly as subtle as what these new editions from Salem contain. And even what these contain are, shall we say, a compromise in order to bring out some of the extraordinarily precise rhythmic subtlety that's indicated in these early manuscripts.
So it's going to look a bit more like, for instance, the modern editions of Dominican Chant.
Yes, that's a great example. Mm-hmm. I'd say that the modern editions of Dominican Chant are far more elegant. But it's something like that. It's really interesting. I mean, if you take a magnifying glass and blow up this font, I mean, it's essentially a font. It's essentially the same kind of process that the monks at Salem came up with. It's really elegant. For instance, it's not a square at the punctum, which is just it's a single note for one syllable. It's not a square like this. It actually has a little bit of an arc on the top and on the bottom. Now, of course, at 8 feet away, it looks like a square. If you really peer closely, I'm afraid this is slightly low res JPEG. But if you look really closely in a nice printing of it, it has a little bit of an arc at the bottom and the top. So even when you see a single note, you're inspired to sing it with a little bit of lift along the lines of what we're doing before with the accents. Further questions? Yes, please.
Thank you so much for the great overview that you've given us on chant and, looking at this music, and you touched on this for a moment, on like the historical context of it, and looking at these melodies, sometimes I'm just struck by how modern they sound. And how accessible they are. Like, how influenced do you think the monks at Salem were by like the musical tastes of the time? Like, were they influenced by like the really, my impression of the sacred music and music in general of that time, looking at things like Gounod or Sanson, and even people like Franck, it's really sappy music, and it's very tuneful music. Were they completely isolated from that, or do you think they actually had a bit of that sort of mentality when they were making those editions?
That is a fantastic question. That is a really, really good question. And the answer is yes, they were. Yes, they certainly were. Dom Maccaro, whom we should really have, if we had, a bit more time, we would go and delve into his whole life. Dom Maccaro, who, as I said, sort of took over from Dom Potier in the furthering of the chant. Dom Maccaro is especially important because not only does he push along the paleographic work in the early 20th century, but also he continues to develop what was becoming known, or I believe was even known already by that point, as the Salem Method, a means of interpreting chant. And that is really important. That is an essential part of what the monks of Salem have given to us. I touched on it briefly, and I think all too briefly, in the example that we were doing of the Amadem Toris Matem. The point of that was that no matter how simple the chant is, no matter how simple the melody is, there's always room for beautiful singing, for elegance in the sung prayer. Now, Dom Maccaro, he enters, I think, 1875. Which is right around the time that Dom Gueranger had died, and he entered the monastery. And prior to his monastic profession, had been quite an accomplished cellist, and he hated chant, absolutely hated it. And he was told, "This is what you're going to do. It's clear you've got musical talent, and you're going to do this." And he said, "Oh my God, I just can't believe I have to do this." And he grew to love the chant, but there's certainly something of a cellist's, sensitivity to how he talks about the ebb and the flow. I think in a way that is not at all distracting. I think he brings a real sort of musical sensitivity to it. I like your point, though, very much your point about the sappiness of a great deal of the music, especially at that time, and frankly, especially in France. As a matter of fact, it dovetails perfectly with a quotation that I brought, which I didn't get to in the main part of the talk, but I think it's quite germane because it describes, because it agrees with your point about about the musical ferment of the age, and how chant both was influenced by that, as almost inevitably it would be, but also how it stands against that. And it's a really interesting quotation because it's from a wonderful novel that a few of us have discussed before, by Huysmans, called A Rebours, translated "Against the Grain" or "Against Nature." And in each, it's a really fascinating book because each chapter is about a different sense perception. He has a whole chapter on perfumes. I mean, you have no idea that you could write that much about smells and taste, and it's a really extraordinary book. But the penultimate chapter is the greatest of them all because he's talking about music, but specifically about sacred music and specifically about chant. And what's really, really interesting to me is that this novel, which is published in 1884, is prior to his conversion. So he was, as you will, if you read the book, you'll see he was. You gather from things he wrote, he was fairly decadent, to put it obliquely. And he ultimately converts to Catholicism. Actually, he's probably best known in France. Well, he's best known for these two books, for A Rebours and for La Cathédrale, which is published in 1898, so 14 years later. And La Cathédrale, by the way, is a wonderful meditation on Chartres. Really in-depth exploration of Chartres. And in it, the thinly disguised autobiographical protagonist talks about how Chartres so deeply influences his Catholic conversion. So, this earlier book, though, Against Nature, prior to his becoming Catholic, what he writes, and again, this is 1880s, right? In the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, in the growing secularist sentiment in France, and I mean really, and it must be said, at times extremely anti-Catholic sentiment. Here's what Joris Karl Huysmans has to say about Chant. Quote, "But above all, he had experienced ineffable pleasures in listening to the plain song, which the organist had kept up in spite of modern prejudices. This form, now looked down upon as an effete and Gothic type of the Christian liturgy, as an antiquarian curiosity, as a relic of barbarous centuries, was the life word," I love that, "the life word of the ancient church, the very spirit of the Middle Ages. It was the prayer of all time set to music in tones modulated in accord with the aspirations of the soul, the never-ceasing hymn of praise that had risen for hundreds of years to the throne of the Most High. This traditional melody was the only one that, with its mighty unison, its solemn, massive harmonies, like blocks of ashlar, could fitly go with the old basilicas and fill their Romanesque vaults, of which it seemed the emanation and the living voice. How many times had he not been entranced and mastered by an irresistible awe when the Christus Factus Est of the Gregorian Chant had swelled up in the nave, whose pillars trembled amid the floating clouds of incense, or when the rolling bass of the De Profundis groaned forth, mournful as a stifled sob, poignant as a despairing cry of mankind bewailing its mortal destiny, imploring the tender mercy of its Savior. In comparison with this magnificent plain song, created by the genius of the church, impersonal, anonymous as the organ itself, whose inventor is unknown, all other religious music seemed to him secular, profane. At bottom, in all the works of Gemelli and Porpora, of Carissimi and Durante, in the most admirable conceptions of Handel and Bach, there was no real renunciation of popular triumph, no sacrifice of artistic success, no abdication of human pride, listening to itself at prayer. At best, in those imposing masses of Lisieux performed at Saint-Roch, was the true religious style renewed, grave and august, making some approach to the unadorned nudity, the austere majesty of the old plain song." Isn't that wonderful? And amazing, this is from a man who it's still a decade and a half before his conversion, or before his before his final conversion. And also interesting that I'm not even sure the extent to which he was hearing what the monks at Salem were singing. He was talking about the older, chant as sung in most parishes, and yet he heard the difference. It's Joris Karl Huysmans. That's Huysman. Please.
You mentioned something about the dark ages of codifying the music, and it's very hard to read this. These old 10th century.
It certainly is.
And was it originally just an oral passing on of the notes?
Very much so.
From the 5th century, 6th century?
Yes, that's very much the case, yeah. It presupposes that the person who's reading it, or the monks who are reading it, already know what the tunes are, and it acts as a reminder of the way that the chant goes. So, is it down on this syllable, or is it a single pitch on that syllable, for instance? But it's not something that someone could take de novo and sing the chant for the first time from that. And what's interesting is that in any notational system, there's a trade-off between accuracy of expression and accuracy of pitch. So what you start to get in later examples of the chant is a greater sense of height. In fact, you can see it a little bit in the comparison between 390, which, as I said, is 10th century and 388, which is 12th century. There's a little bit of sense of height in these neumes, like on Alma, where the relative height of the neumes is indicating the relative height of the voice. In the 390 example, it just says on this particular syllable it's going up, but it doesn't say at all is it going up higher than the preceding note or lower, does it start lower than the preceding note? It just says it's going up. So that only makes sense if you sing this in a context, in a daily context, where this is, as it were, your bread and butter. Tom.
Thank you, David, for so much fascinating information. You often hear about that for many, many years chant was performed incorrectly and badly, and usually you hear that it was Pius X's document on music that began the restoration. Could you just talk about that in the context of the other things you were talking about? And then secondly, you focused a lot on France, but now, was chant lost or abused in the course of history, even within the Vatican?
That's a really good question, Tom. The answer is yes and no. The reason I focus on France is because of Salem, and I think the story of this unique monastery and its unique mission is so edifying for us in our context here, in 2021. Was the chant sung well? Well, in some places, yes, absolutely. 1850s, absolutely. I mean, this, as I said, this the quotation that I just had read a moment ago from Arebor was probably not based on what the Salem monks were singing, because that was not so well known in France at that time. So yes, it was being sung quite beautifully. But then in other places, and especially in Italy, also in this country, it was not uncommon for the soprano soloist to say to the organist, I'm not going to do the Benedictus from this mass. I'm going to do the aria that I sang at the opera last night. I mean, completely secular. I mean, it's almost inconceivable how bizarre that is. So I should mention that the charge of the chant not being performed properly is something that is always hurled, because there are scholars of the chant in the 1950s, including, especially I should say, monks at Salem, like Dom Cardin, who make that charge about Dom Maccaro, that this is sort of stuck in that 19th century aesthetic, and we need to break free from that. And find the pure chant. Well, this is a thing we hear all the time. I mean, there's perhaps an interesting analog. Well, in fact, it's not even an analog. It's a direct similarity in the wars that are fought in classical music circles in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s over historical performance practice. There's a really, really good and really, really polemical book by the musicologist Richard Taruskin called Text and Act, which I highly recommend. It's a most engrossing read. And he says, look, any claim to historical purity and the aesthetic items, let's say, that entails, tell you far more about the age in which the person who's making the argument lived than anything about when it was written. And so that's true. In the 1950s, there's a bit more in almost all spheres, right? In painting and architecture, certainly. There's this slightly stripped down, spare, somewhat mechanical approach that we can see as a reaction to World War II and the horrors of World War I and and the excesses of the Baroque, as they say, and the medieval accretions, that term we hear applied to the Middle Ages so often. That same is true in chant. It's really interesting, and I think for us in this room in particular, it's interesting to note that the places that preserve the older Salem method, that is the method as was being developed by Dom Poitiers under the guidance of Gueranger, and especially by Dom Maquereau, now, in the 21st century, the places that tend to preserve that the best are the traditional monasteries. I should say specifically the monasteries that follow the traditional mass, the traditional office, and the same is true of parish churches too. But you're more likely to encounter a Cardine approach in a monastery to begin with, or I should say, if you encounter it anywhere, it's most likely to be at a monastery. So it's really interesting. If you go to Salem now and hear the office being sung, it's not going to be the way that Dom Poitiers heard it or Dom Maquereau heard it, and they're rather adamant on the point. It's maybe softening a little bit now. I should say it is softening a little bit now. But you go to Foncombeau and its daughter houses, and there the classical Salem school is very much the order of the day, and they see their mission of preserving this easy to digest, easy to teach method of Maquereau as part and parcel of the preservation of the traditional Roman Mass and the traditional Benedictine office. Yes, please.
In terms of practice, though, the impression I get is that the French Salem way of doing chironomy is more of a practical and a bit of a romantic sort of approach, whereas the German semiological sort of way of doing it is more of a historically informed thing. And I have heard things being said about it that kind of give me an idea that it's kind of restricted to HIP circles and a bunch of HIP performers, HIP nerds in the room doing their thing. What would you say about that? Because
that's not true. Actually, I mean, there are monasteries that are doing that. Are doing that. That semiological approach. I think it makes more sense in the context of a monastery where you have that daily singing together, because of the fact that it's not a method. It often tends to be whatever the director thinks should be the interpretation of that chant, then that's what you do. And so you have to sort of learn what your director wants. I mean, it's quite interesting to watch the conducting, to the extent that there is any, of those who practice the, say, a Cardine type semiology, because there's not a lot of it happening. And but it's also quite hard to go and join that choir if you're passing through town and you want to come and sing on a Sunday morning. You have no idea how they're interpreting the Climacus. Is that going to be a rhythmic thing going down? Are the diamond notes half the value? Are they just faster? I mean, it becomes rather idiosyncratic. And so maybe a parallel can be drawn between the pastoral approach the church takes in the 1580s by just trimming the chant down, between that and the pastoral approach of Dom Poitiers and Dom Maquereau in developing a method that allows the chant to be sung by people from all over the world, from all different backgrounds, but in a way that is unified. Now, it's really interesting. I'm involved and have been my entire professional career with a really, really wonderful group called the Church Music Association of America, the CMAA, and we have an annual sacred music colloquium. And we have some people on our faculty who are dyed-in-the-wool Salem, old school Salem practitioners, and there are some who who espouse the views of Cardin a little bit more. But it's really interesting to hear how they often come to the same conclusions when conducting. I mean, if you were to just hear them, you hear a lot of agreement, because the Salem, I think the classical Salem method is unfairly tarnished as sort of a robotic thing like this. With the counting of groups in twos and threes. I liken it more to a topographical map, that has the grid. So in order to describe, is that a mountain or is that a valley, you need some sort of grid in order to be able to determine where you are. But the fact of a grid describing the chant, that doesn't mean that suddenly you've hemmed in, Mount Washington into a square, right? It doesn't become a square just in virtue of being described by means of a square. So I think the same sort of thing applies here. And to be sure, I've heard choirs following the Salem method where it is this 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and it's awful. I mean, it's really, really awful. So there needs to be musicality that's brought to it, and a study of the manuscripts. The old manuscripts, I think, can be quite illuminating. I see the Salem method, the classical Salem method, as more of a tool, so that everyone can agree on where the points are, so that the choronomy makes sense to the choir. If that makes sense. John.
Thank you. Yeah, while you were speaking, I checked the other 3 Marian hymns, and none of them scan metrically. I mean, they might be hendecasyllables or something, something that I'm not so good at scanning off the top of my head. But do we find, whether Homeric meter or other meters in other parts of the Christian thing? I've chanted the Alma de Toris Mater a million times and had no idea that it was just like, Virgil's Aeneid or whatever, metrically speaking.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a rather unusual example. I'm sure there are other examples. I think the Alma Redemptoris is maybe the most, probably the best known example. But yeah.
There was another question.
Mrs. Chess.
So could you say a few words about your third area? You've gotten into the contemporary times, and just from my own experience, I think we're very blessed in the New York area because we hear beautiful chant in many places. We live in Connecticut and New York, but if you go to other parts of the country, they're trying to sing it, but it's not. It's harder for them. It's not as well known, and I mean, there are a lot of challenges, and I know you met one of those challenges. He founded a group in Connecticut called the Viri Galilei some years ago, and those men went around and sang at other places. Even if David couldn't be there, groups of them would go and sing in other churches in other Latin masses, and there's still a group of them that sing at St. Roch in Greenwich. Mm-hmm. That's from your group. But anyway, I just wondered if you could comment about that, and how it's a challenge.
Sure.
It's a challenge to learn this music, to sing it well.
Well, that's a great question, Jill, and thanks for mentioning the Viri Galilei. If you remember, I gave the example of starting small. Just do something. If it means that you're printing a book of the chant for the grace before dinner, then print that chant of the book of the chants before dinner. I was inspired to start the Viri Galilei over 6 years ago now. I attended a workshop conducted by Marcel Perez, who was the founder of the ensemble Organum. And I was really impressed and struck by his style of teaching, which was almost the opposite of didactic, almost as non-didactic as you can get. On the first day, he gave a wonderful discourse about these questions of the Salem edition, the Vatican edition of the chant. But then most of the rest of the week, he would sing a phrase. He'd sit in the front of the room and sip his tea, sip his mate, and he'd say, ah. And everyone would go, ah, and he wouldn't say no, he'd just repeat it again, ah, and everyone would go, ah, like this, just sort of call and response. And I realized, gosh, if we're going to sing Vespers, because a few men I knew had been asking me for several months if we could maybe sing Vespers, I said, look, if we're going to sing Vespers, the only way to do it is to sing Vespers. It's not to have rehearsals and rehearsals and rehearsals. I mean, or have a conference on the nature of Vespers. I mean, and that's good and well. I mean, it's a very important thing. But if you actually want to do it, you just need to do it. I mean, it's like praying the Rosary. You don't pray the Rosary by reading a treatise on praying the Rosary. You take out your beads and you start, right? So I called up a bunch of men I knew, from the general area in Connecticut and New York, and said, hey, I'm starting this new group. Do you want to come? And they said, well, I've never sung before. And I said, great, that means you've got no bad habits, so come on board. And I said, the only thing I ask is that the first month you make a commitment to be there every single week, because you won't get better if you don't come every week. And so, okay, fine. And we've now done that every Wednesday night for the last 6.5 years. We started by singing Vespers. Now we sing Mass and then sing Vespers, and we go out to eat at a great restaurant in Norwalk and have conversation about politics, theology, just whatever should happen to come up that week. And it's been really great to see men who had never really sung a lot of chant before start going around to other parishes. So now, I actually, among the things I have to do when I get home tonight is send an email to all the Viri about all the Rorate masses that are happening in Connecticut, saying, all right, well, the director of so-and-so at 6 a.m. is asking for volunteers in Fairfield and 5:30 in Enfield and 6 o'clock in Waterbury, this sort of thing. And if you can sing, go show up, because a lot of the guys who are doing that are men from the group, And I agree 100% with what you say about the chant in the New York area. What we have here is something really special. Don't take it for granted. I mean, I do traveling to do chant workshops from time to time, and there's not nearly the same concentration either of Latin masses or of people who are reasonably skilled in the chant. And I think part of what helps define this too is there's a real spirit of cooperation among all the church musicians. In New York and New Jersey and Connecticut. And if someone needs help, we call each other up, right? Pedro and I are on the phone all the time. Hey, can you sub for me at this mass, or do you know someone who could sing the tenor on a funeral in the morning or something like that? I think there's a real sense that a rising tide floats all boats, and I find it spiritually quite edifying, actually, as well as aesthetically. Perhaps one more question. I don't want to
We've all learned so much, and I have a request. And before we wrap up, I was hoping that you could close us and lead us in the Alma Redemptoris Mater. And
you've read my mind.
And if I could just ask if when we close, if maybe one or two of the knights could stay and help us clean up, because they have an event. Speaking of sacred art, tomorrow there's a sacred art conference, and there's a young adults convivium here. Following the traditional mass. So we continue to invoke our founder, Michael McGivney. If anybody's interested, any of the men are interested in the knights, you can speak to Johnny Egan or one of the knights. Okay, and there's a collection of traditional Knights of Columbus councils. A lot of people don't know. It's over 24 now in this country, and there's a monthly call that we're part of, and there's not just local initiatives but national initiatives, and it's all about propagating the traditional right. So,
that's so great. That's so great.
Yeah. So thank you.
How about we end by doing the Alma? We'll do the simple Alma Redemptoris on the left, and we'll sing it with the same sense of elan. How about we stand up to sing it? Close.
Surgere qui cora
Let's have a nice hand for our speaker, Mr. David Hughes.